It's Michelle of Lab Muffin Beauty Science, Chemistry PhD, Cosmetic Chemist, and Professional Sunscreen Video Maker. I have talked a ton about sunscreen over the years, but I found that on every sunscreen video I get asked questions that I've answered in another video. And I think it's because I've gotten a lot of new followers, so hi, welcome, and thank you. So I thought I'd do a video where I tried to cover every sunscreen question that's relevant to wearing sunscreen, which I realized 4,500 words into the script is a very lofty goal. And I'm sure the moment I publish this video, I'll think of 3 more. So here is almost all your sunscreen questions answered. Like and subscribe so you don't miss out on me answering those 3 questions that I forgot about. I've done tons of videos and blog posts on sunscreen. I also have an ebook that has a sunscreen chapter. So I'll be summarizing a lot of things. I'll put links to the more detailed explanations in the description, so please check that before you send me comments saying I'm talking out my... Let's get into it. When do I need to wear sunscreen? I'm not your mum, so you don't need to do anything. However, these are the official Australian guidelines, which are a collaboration between experts from dermatology, as well as from endocrinology, bone health, and cancer. The World Health Organization has similar guidelines as well, and they're meant to balance the health risks and the benefits of sun exposure. So skin cancer versus the benefits, which is mostly vitamin D production. They recommend that when the UV index is 3 or above in the middle of the day, you should use sun protection if you go outside for more than a few minutes. Even with sun protection, you'll probably still produce enough vitamin D. When the UV index is below 3, then sun protection is not recommended, and they recommend that you go outdoors in the middle of the day with uncovered skin on most days. Now, these guidelines are very general and it's just for skin cancer risk, so wearing sunscreen when the UV index is 3 or above is sort of like bare minimum stuff. And the evidence points towards sunscreen specifically not making that much of a difference when it comes to vitamin D production. All the little bits of your body that don't get covered in enough sunscreen will make vitamin D when you're in the sun anyway. So if you're trying to improve your skin and deal with skin concerns like acne, uneven pigment, premature aging, so fine lines and wrinkles, which I'm guessing you are since you're watching this video, then you probably should wear sunscreen on your face every day if you're going outside. The sun's UV is the biggest preventable cause of skin aging and pigmentation. Prevention is much easier and more effective than trying to undo the damage later, and it's usually cheaper as well. This is especially the case when it comes to deeper damage that you need procedures to tackle and not just skincare. If you're not wearing sunscreen, it means that your skincare products have to work harder to get results. It's like they're swimming upstream against the current. So if you use sunscreen to block out a bunch of that UV, stop some of that current in this analogy, then your products will be able to work better. There's actually a study that found that skin texture, clarity, and pigmentation improved with just wearing sunscreen daily. So your skin has the ability to repair itself if you cut down the amount of UV smashing into it. Sunscreen is especially important if you're using skincare products with alpha hydroxy acids like glycolic and lactic acids. These chemical exfoliants actually make your skin more sensitive to UV. So if you're not wearing sunscreen as well, it can actually mean your anti-aging skincare is making your skin age faster, which is really rude. What should I look for in a sunscreen? Basically, all it comes down to is it protective enough for what you're doing, and is it comfortable and budget-friendly enough that you'll wear enough of it? So let's start with protection. The most important thing is SPF. SPF tells you how well the sunscreen protects against burning, which is mostly to do with shorter wavelengths of UV called UVB. These are also the most damaging rays of UV, as well as burning. They cause skin cancer and premature skin aging. Higher SPF is better. The protection you get is proportional to that SPF number. That's why SPF ratings were designed the way they are. The whole SPF 30 already protects against 97% of UV is a myth. For most people, SPF 30 is enough for an everyday sunscreen, but you might want higher protection if you're getting a lot of sun, or if you just want higher protection. The downside of higher SPF is that the formulas can be a bit thicker and less nice to wear, but this has been improving a lot in the last 5 years. UVA protection is also important. UVA refers to the longer, lower energy wavelengths of UV that cause less burning, but they're still linked to skin aging, cancers, and increased pigment production. UVA protection is a bit trickier than SPF because there isn't really a universally agreed upon way of measuring UVA protection, and some countries like Australia actually don't let brands show more detailed UVA protection numbers. There are a lot of different labels used in different places, so I'm just going to show a summary on screen and you can check my UVA video for more info. Basically, you want to go for at least broad spectrum. If you care a lot about hyperpigmentation or premature aging, you'll want to look for higher UVA protection. Water resistance is the final special sunscreen label that's regulated. It tells you how much SPF protection is left after sitting in water for a particular amount of time. In general, more water-resistant sunscreens are also more resistant to other things like sweat, sand, rubbing, and movement. So it's a good idea to use water-resistant sunscreen if you're obviously getting into the water, but also if you're just moving around a lot while getting sun exposure. Water resistance is a bit tricky because different regions have different rules, even though the label is the same. Australia and the US have the strictest ones. Now, if you have darker skin, so Fitzpatrick 4 or above, and you're worried about pigmentation, you might want to use a tinted sunscreen to protect against visible light from the sun. Physical sunscreens without a tint aren't very good for this, and tinted chemical sunscreens work about as well as tinted physical sunscreens. It's really just about that tint. Tinted sunscreens aren't really regulated for visible light protection, so it's hard to say which one is best. Foundation probably works great for this as well. Aside from protection, it's really just personal preference with things like texture, white cast, skin sensitivity, and cost. You need a sunscreen that you enjoy enough to apply regularly and that you can afford to apply regularly because you do need to apply quite a bit of sunscreen. Texture is incredibly important and I think quite underrated. These days, there are lots of really nicely textured sunscreens that give great protection. They can feel just like primer or moisturiser. If a sunscreen has a texture that you hate, it's more likely to just sit on the shelf unused and you're less likely to apply enough of it. There's a lot of talk about chemical versus physical sunscreens, but they're actually really similar, and the things that I've already mentioned are way more important. My very general rule of thumb is if your biggest problem with sunscreen is texture or white cast, I would recommend trying a chemical sunscreen first, but if your biggest problem is irritation, then I would recommend trying a physical sunscreen first. There are also combination sunscreens which have a mix of chemical and physical filters. They tend to be somewhere in between the two for texture and white cast. I personally use a few different categories of sunscreen for different situations. I have everyday sunscreens that are light and comfortable. They sit really nicely under makeup and they don't clog my pores that much. For me, these have to be above SPF 30, they have to have good UVA protection, and I prefer newer filters that are less irritating to my skin and eyes. I also have hardcore face sunscreens that I use for outdoor activities when I don't really care how I look and sun protection is really that priority. These are SPF 50+, broad spectrum, and water resistant. I also have hardcore sunscreens for my body for outdoor activities. These are also SPF 50+, broad spectrum, and water resistant, but also relatively cheap, so I'm not tempted to apply less to save money. Ideally, these also work for my face, so I don't have to mess around with 2 bottles when it's time to reapply. I have a video with my favorite sunscreens from last year, and I've added a few to the list since then. These are all in the description. How much sunscreen do I apply? To get the SPF on the label, you have to apply 2 milligrams per square centimeter, which works out to be a bit less than a quarter teaspoon for just your face for most people. Since the amount you need depends on your face size, the actual amount will be a bit different for everyone. You can try to measure your face, but it is a bit of effort, so if in doubt, just aim for a quarter teaspoon. You might have heard of using 2 fingers of sunscreen. Obviously, the amount depends a lot on how thick your lines are, so if you're not sure, you can try scraping your lines into a quarter teaspoon measure. The reason you have to apply so much is that your skin is bumpy. So if you don't apply enough, then the sunscreen sits in the valleys of your skin and the hills don't get covered, or the layer just ends up way too thin. A little goes a long way just doesn't work with sunscreen. It's like a paint that you're wearing to hide your skin from the sun. If you don't have enough paint on, then parts of your skin will be exposed. For the rest of your body, there are a lot of different recommendations for how much you need to apply because different places use different estimates for different size people. And chances are your proportions don't match the ones they calculated for, so when in doubt, just apply more than you need. My favorite version is the Cancer Council version because I think it's the easiest one to memorize. It's 1 teaspoon for each of these parts. How do I actually apply sunscreen? Now for actually applying it, I think it's really helpful to remember that sunscreen works best when it's in a smooth, even, undisturbed layer. So with that in mind, it probably makes the most sense to put sunscreen on your skin after skincare, regardless of what type of sunscreen it is. Chemical sunscreens don't need to absorb into bare skin to activate and work. The only exception is if it's a special type of long wear sunscreen that's meant to absorb into your skin. Those usually form a film in the top of your skin, so you probably don't want tons of skincare under or over it. Use your skincare a few hours earlier. Try to make sure the sunscreen is evenly spread over your skin. You can dab it onto the different parts of your face at the start. You don't want to rub too much. There's a study showing that rubbing reduces protection. So apply it evenly and then let it dry down. Don't rub it in the whole time. You should also apply all sunscreens before you go outside. Sunscreens don't need time to activate, but they do need time to settle down and not get wiped off onto your clothes or get disturbed by too much moving. It's a lot like wet paint. The recommendation is usually 15 minutes, but it depends on the sunscreen. In one study, the sunscreen they used only needed 8 minutes. How do I apply sunscreen when I'm also wearing skincare and makeup? Sunscreen makes the most sense in between skincare and makeup, so your skincare can sink into your skin and not mess up your sunscreen, and so your sunscreen doesn't mess up your makeup. Again, I think it's really helpful to remember that sunscreen works best when it's in a smooth, even, undisturbed layer. There aren't a lot of studies done on wearing sunscreen with other products, but based on studies for other situations, it seems like anything under the sunscreen, but especially on top of the sunscreen, can mess up your sunscreen layer. So try to minimize the amount of skincare you're using under the sunscreen, so keep it to 1 or 2 products, and minimize the makeup that you use on top of the sunscreen. Again, try to wait for the sunscreen layer to flatten down and stick to your skin before you apply your makeup, maybe 5-10 minutes, and try to apply your makeup as gently as possible. It's also probably best to use a sunscreen with a higher SPF than you need, so if it drops from the makeup, then you'll still be getting the SPF you want. How can you stop sunscreen from balling up? When sunscreen balls up, it's usually A, interacting with your skincare, B, drying too fast, or C, you're rubbing it too much. So you can try A, applying it on bare skin, B, applying it on massively moisturized skin, or C, patting it on gently. Unfortunately, my skin is really oily, and sometimes my own face oil is actually what's making it ball up, and people with dry skin have no problems with the same sunscreen. So if you've tried the above and none of that worked, I would just try a different sunscreen. I found so many that work well on my skin, even though I think I have a really ball-prone skin type. How do I look less shiny with sunscreen on? A lot of sunscreens are oily because a lot of sunscreen actives are oils or dissolved in oils. So if you blot away the oil, you're probably going to remove some sunscreen as well. The best way I've found to reduce shine without lowering the protection too much is to wait for the sunscreen to set and then gently pat on some translucent powder on top. I really like starch-based powders for this, and this can also soak up any extra oil that I produce during the day. And I would also recommend just looking for a less shiny sunscreen to buy the next time. Can I use blank instead of sunscreen? You might have some products that say SPF on them and you're wondering if you can use them instead of sunscreen. The answer is usually no. The main thing to remember is you need to apply about 1/4 teaspoon to your face, and some products just don't really work that way for applying that much. Foundation with SPF, this is what you look like when you apply the proper amount. I usually apply about 1/8 of this. A very sheer foundation might potentially work, but I haven't found one that doesn't do this. Powder with SPF, it just doesn't stick to your skin enough. This is what it looks like when you apply the right amount. The powder that works best is probably the Color Science powder that's designed for this, but even then their evidence doesn't really convince me that you can apply enough. Things that do work, moisturiser with SPF, if you can apply the right amount. This depends on the moisturizer texture, but in terms of the formula, sunscreens are the same as moisturizers with SPF. They just chose a different name to put on the label. Body sunscreens. Yes, you can use body sunscreens on your face and face sunscreens on your body. The only minor issue is that body products tend to spread more easily and be a bit heavier, but if you're fine with that, then it's fine. UV protective clothing is fantastic, but obviously some skin is usually uncovered. Regular clothes can work as well, depending on the fabric. Hats and umbrellas are useful, but most of the UV you get actually gets bounced from the sky rather than coming directly from the sun. So the lower parts of your face actually get a lot less protection. So these are good to use in conjunction with sunscreen to add extra layers of protection. Think of it like layers of Swiss cheese. Layering enough types of imperfect protection will give you pretty good protection overall. Can I mix sunscreen with foundation or moisturizer or another sunscreen? It's best not to mix sunscreens with any other products. Even though it can make it feel nicer or get rid of white casts or make your routine faster, it changes the way the sunscreen dries, which can mean you get holes in your protection. Sunscreens are emulsions like mayonnaise. If you have the wrong proportions, then the emulsion can break and separate. If you've ever seen how foundation can bunch up if you apply it over the wrong product, the same thing can happen to sunscreen. And if that's happening on a microscopic level, you won't be able to spot it and stop doing it. It's best to just look for a sunscreen that already does what you want. If you don't want white cast, then go for a chemical sunscreen. If you want a tint, then go for tinted sunscreen. Even worse are those sunscreen drop products that you're meant to mix into a moisturiser to make your own sunscreen. This means that you have this holy film issue, plus you end up applying so little of it that you end up with really low SPF. Can I make my own DIY sunscreen? So I mentioned the sunscreen drop products that you mix into other products end up with really low protection and unreliable film formation. There are also DIY sunscreen recipes that involve mixing zinc oxide powder or diaper cream into oils or moisturizers to get around 20% zinc oxide, which matches the percentage in a store-bought sunscreen. This doesn't work because protection isn't about the percentage of the active ingredients, it's also about how they're distributed in the sunscreen and how that applies on the skin. Sunscreen uses special grades of zinc oxide with very small particles. This makes it absorb more UV, and it can also cover a larger area. Even with 20% of this special zinc oxide mixed with industrial equipment that can make the zinc oxide spread out more evenly in the sunscreen formulators still get low SPF sometimes. This is because the base isn't keeping that zinc oxide spread out properly when you apply it to your skin. So as sunscreen formulators can't get consistently high SPF with all of this special stuff, the chance of you getting it right consistently at home with the wrong kind of zinc oxide is not great. Can I use expired sunscreen? There's no guarantee the sunscreen will be working after the expiry date, so I would recommend throwing expired sunscreen out. Also, don't store sunscreen in the heat. It can break down and separate even before it expires, which means you won't get even protection. So don't store it in your car glove box, and if you're at the beach or at the park, try to keep it in the shade. Do I need to reapply sunscreen? The main reason you need to reapply sunscreen is that the sunscreen layer gets less even over time. Like foundation, the sunscreen layer clumps up over time because your skin is moving and producing sweat and oil underneath. That means you'll start getting tiny gaps in your sunscreen layer that the UV can get through. Some of the sunscreen also evaporates into the air and absorbs into your skin, so that sunscreen layer will get thinner and less effective. Sunscreen can also get wiped off onto things, and if you wet the sunscreen layer, that can also clump up, even if it's a water-resistant sunscreen. So after you've had your sunscreen on for 2 hours, you're probably not getting that label protection anymore, which is an issue if you're about to get more sun exposure. Important note, this is 2 hours of the sunscreen being on your skin, not 2 hours of sun exposure. There's this misconception that reapplying sunscreen is because the sunscreen ingredients stop working after absorbing 2 hours of sun. This is a myth. Most sunscreens are pretty photostable now, so the ingredients almost always keep working for longer than the sunscreen film takes to clump up. This 2 hours is also just a general rule. There's evidence that some sunscreens can last a lot longer. And obviously, if you're sweating or moving around a lot and your sunscreen isn't water resistant, it probably won't be staying put. If you aren't moving around a lot, then you probably still have pretty decent protection after a few hours. But no one's tested the protection for a wide range of sunscreens, so it's really hard to say how much. And unfortunately, you can't really rely on what you see with a UV camera. UV cameras don't have enough resolution to tell what's going on, and they work on UVA only. One study found that the UV photo looked exactly the same, even with around 15% less SPF. How do I reapply sunscreen? I think reapplying sunscreen on your body is pretty straightforward, but how do you reapply it on your face? And how do you do it if you're wearing makeup? Unfortunately, there isn't really a perfect way to get high protection while keeping your makeup intact, so I approach it depending on how much sun exposure I'm going to get afterwards. Situation 1 is if I'm getting a lot of sun exposure, say I'm going on a long beach walk in the afternoon. Then I keep my makeup simple and just reapply the full amount of sunscreen like normal every 2 hours, followed by minimal makeup. You don't have to wash off your sunscreen, you can just reapply on top, but if there's dirt on your face or if it's just getting a bit messy, you can wipe it off before you reapply. Situation 2 is if I'm getting some sun and I want to keep my makeup mostly intact. Say it's summer and I'm walking outside for 20 minutes after work. Then I reapply sunscreen on top of my makeup right before I go out. There are only really two options for this that I think give enough protection. The option I prefer is reapplying a light regular sunscreen over my makeup. I use a cushion puff, which is a method that Jude of 50 Shades of Snail came up with around 2015. I really love these because they're so thin, they're really portable, and they don't absorb much sunscreen. It is still good to use a bit more sunscreen than normal to make up for what ends up in the sponge. There are sunscreen cushions from Asian brands as well that are designed for reapplying over makeup, but I find those too expensive, plus they usually have a white cast. The other option that can give decent coverage is a spray. Sprays can get into the valleys of your skin, but the main issue is that sprays can be a bit light in some spots, so you need to make sure you apply enough layers. So if you're using a spray, make sure you apply enough layers. Let each layer dry down before you apply the next layer. You can spray your spray into a 1/4 teaspoon measure to work out how many sprays you need. The other issue is that breathing in too much sunscreen probably isn't very good for you, so if you use a spray, make sure you hold your breath and walk out of the cloud of spray before you breathe in again. Also be careful if it's too windy because the spray just won't land on your skin. I would also avoid aerosol sunscreens. The SPF test is usually done before adding propellant, so you need to apply a lot more to get that labeled protection. For reapplication, it's always safest to go with a sunscreen that has similar active ingredients to what you're already wearing. There's a slight chance that the sunscreen actives can react with each other and break down. If you aren't mixing them around a lot, then it shouldn't be a huge problem, but it is safest to try to avoid that anyway. Situation 3 is when I get minimal sun. So for example, I'm going outside for 5 minutes and it's mostly shady. In that case, I don't reapply, I rely on what I have on already and just try to stay in the shade. You can also use those layers of protection, so hats, shades, sunglasses, umbrellas are great if you don't think your reapplication was quite enough, and also just generally when you're getting a lot of sun. Can I transfer sunscreen into a different container? I would really recommend not doing that, especially not for a long time. A lot of sunscreen ingredients can react with or soak into some plastics. This means you can end up with less active ingredients in the sunscreen and the sunscreen can dry in weird ways on your skin. Glass should be okay if it's very clean and if you keep it protected from light. How do I deal with eye sting? Some sunscreens can sting your eyes and annoyingly, it seems to be different ingredients and sunscreens for different people. There are some sunscreens out there that don't sting your eyes much, so look at reviews for those. But if you found the perfect sunscreen apart from eye sting, you can use a different sunscreen for around your eyes. I like to use a zinc oxide sunscreen stick because they tend to stay put for longer and zinc oxide tends to not make your eyes water. Some people also find that setting their sunscreen with translucent powder helps, but that isn't quite enough for me. Do I need to wear sunscreen indoors? Probably not. You probably aren't getting enough UV inside your house. Window glass blocks almost all the UVB, but UVA can still come through, and that can potentially cause premature aging and increased pigment. But the roof and the walls are probably blocking the vast majority of it unless you have sunlight directly hitting your skin through a window, or if you're sitting next to a big window and you can see lots of sky through it. Monitors and phone screens don't produce enough damaging light to worry about unless you have a special condition, and you would know if you have one of these. Fluorescent lights also don't produce much UV if they're properly shielded. Maybe be careful if you have a bare bulb, particularly an older curly bulb. There are a lot of other myths about sunscreen that I haven't covered here, and I'm sure there'll be even more to come. But here is a list of myths that I've debunked before. I've linked the long versions in the description, but here is my attempt to speedrun the more common ones in 20 words or less each. Chemical sunscreens are dangerous hormonal disruptors. Legal limits based on all relevant data in context with large margin of safety. Fear-mongering sites show select studies only. Nanoparticles are dangerous. Nanoparticles don't penetrate beyond the stratum corneum with unbroken skin. Chemical and physical sunscreens work differently. Both mostly work the same. Only 5 to 10% UV is scattered by physical sunscreens, the rest is absorbed. Physical sunscreens work better. How well sunscreen works depends on SPF and UVA-PF. Chemical sunscreens can get higher SPFs and UVA-PFs. Heat from chemical sunscreens is bad for melasma. Chemical and physical sunscreens produce around same heat. That amount is undetectable. Some sunscreens aren't reef-safe. Climate change, agricultural pollution, overfishing are killing reefs. Way too little sunscreen in ocean to make a difference. Sunscreens contain carcinogenic benzene. Amounts in sunscreen are tiny, you get more from parking your car in a garage attached to your house. If I didn't answer something in enough detail, I've probably covered it in a different video. I've done a lot of sunscreen videos and blog posts and Instagram posts. If you want more practical specifics about finding and using sunscreen and setting up a skincare routine, check out my ebook. If you're a sunscreen nerd, the Sunscreen E-Summit is coming up. It's a free conference on May 15th hosted by me and Jen of the EcoWell. We've locked in talks from some of the top sunscreen experts in the industry. I'll be talking about sunscreen myth busting. It is going to be an incredible event. So make sure you book in for that and check out more videos from me coming up on the side here.